The next biblical covenant is certainly one of the most important in the Bible and has tremendous ramifications for humanity. And that is the covenant that God made with Abraham. Now, although Genesis chapter 12 is often pointed to as the Abrahamic covenant, especially the first 3 verses of chapter 12, there is no covenant made with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. There is an arrangement and a promise that is made. As I've said, promise is not the same necessarily as a covenant. Covenants involve promises, but every promise is not a covenant. In Genesis chapter 12, we see Abraham having left his homeland in Ur of the Chaldees, coming north and then coming down south into Canaan, the promised land. There he is promised that he will have descendants, that his descendants will become a great people, and that they will inhabit that land, that particular piece of real estate. And that in him, moreover, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Abraham himself, of course, will have a great name on top of that. So these promises are made in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and then verse 7. The covenant itself, though, isn't made until Genesis chapter 15. And in Genesis chapter 15, what we find is Abraham wondering if he's actually going to have this promised seed, this son that God has said he's going to have. And he wonders whether Eliezer, the Syrian, is actually going to be the heir of his household. And maybe that's how God is going to answer that promise. Maybe God didn't mean it literally. But God dismisses that idea. It becomes very clear that Abraham is going to have an actual son. And it's going to be through him that his descendants will come from. It is on the promise of that, Genesis 15:6, where Abraham is taken outside and he is shown the stars and asked to count them, and believes that when God says that your seed will be as numerous as the stars or the sand of the seashore, and he credited it to Abraham as righteousness. Why? Well, because, and don't miss this, it's because Abraham believed what God said, didn't spiritualize what God said. He actually believed that God meant what he said. Then what we find is that the question of the land comes up, and God puts Abraham into deep sleep after Abraham has arranged sacrificial animals and driven the birds away because of the momentous importance of what was about to happen. God puts Abraham into a deep sleep, and God himself passes through the parts of the divided animals, thereby uttering what was called a self-maledictory oath, that if God broke the oath that he unilaterally entered into when he passed through the parts, then that self-malediction would come back on him. We know this, by the way, clearly from Jeremiah 34, when Zechariah and the elders did that very thing and God called them on it. But we'll say more about that another time. Then what God does is that he describes the perimeters of the land that is going to be given to the descendants of Abraham. This land is approximately 300,000 square miles in area, which is a land area that actually Israel has never occupied. So it appears, therefore, that there is a covenantal prediction and promise in there, both of a literal descendant and then a nation coming from him, and then of course a place for the nation to dwell in. The land and the people belonging together under the stipulations of the Abrahamic covenant. Now later on, in Genesis 17, and then repeated in Genesis 18, and then in Genesis 22, and also to Isaac and also to Jacob, we see the elements of land and people brought together as part of the Abrahamic covenant. But we also see this other third aspect too, that in Abraham and in his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, there is no contradiction between the three aspects of the Abrahamic covenant, not if you read them correctly. Obviously, anybody who pays attention to the Genesis narrative, and also especially to the prophets, knows that the people of Israel and the land of Israel belong together. The land is called Israel's land, often in the prophets. So those two aspects of the Abrahamic covenant belong together. The third aspect, the blessing upon the nations, comes as a result of the nation of Israel, the literal descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the one special seed, Genesis 22:18, is probably pointing straight to Christ, who will be the means by which salvation will come not only upon the people of Israel, but also upon the nations of the earth. Therefore, from Abraham's literal seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Doesn't mean that that the other nations that share in the provisions of the third aspect of the Abrahamic covenant also share in the first two, the literal descendancy from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise of the land of Canaan. But this is in fact what many Christian theologians do with the Abrahamic covenant. They say that the land is not an important aspect of it, and that that's been enlarged. Well, not according to the author of Genesis, it's not. Not according to the author of Psalms, Psalm 106. Not according to the prophets. Not even according to the early chapters of the Gospels. So obviously many Christians, unfortunately, are reading that third aspect of the Abrahamic covenant and using it to drown out and wash out the first two aspects of the covenant. We can't do that. We need to keep the three in their proper balance. God knows what he's doing, and he'll sort any problems that we think are there, he'll sort them out. So the Abrahamic covenant, therefore, both ensures the survival of the Jewish race through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not every Jew is a true Jew, as both the Old Testament and Paul's epistles make clear, because they're not all believing Jews, and you have to be a godly believing Jew in order to inherit the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. But they will inherit them. But as far as the nations are concerned, we can be called and are called Abraham's seed by Paul because of the third part of the covenant. No, we're not Israel. Israel is the name given to Jacob, and we're not descendants of Jacob. No, we're not given the land of Canaan. That was given to the nation of Israel. But yes, we are Abraham's seed in that third aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, that through him all the nations will be blessed. And we've certainly been partakers of that aspect of the Abrahamic covenant. So what we have then with the Abrahamic covenant is a program. The Noahic covenant sets up a stage upon which the other covenantal programs are going to be played out to their consummation. But the Abrahamic covenant sets up these three strands. First strand is the nationhood through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promised seed. Through them, of course, Christ will come, but the words there are there. Certainly most of the places that it's used does not mean just Christ. It means a group, a nation of descendants, an ethnic group. Secondly, that ethnic group is to have a particular land that's been described in Genesis 15. And so thirdly, the nations of the earth don't all of a sudden become the new Israel just because they enter into certain provisions of blessing in the third part of the Abrahamic covenant, but they enter into the Abrahamic covenant in those areas covered by that third aspect, which, by the way, when you read Paul in Romans chapter 4 or Galatians chapter 3 or any other area, you will see he is very careful to quote only the specific aspects of the Abrahamic covenant that have anything to do with Gentiles. That is this third aspect. He does not quote the land promise, and he does not quote the nation promise, because they are not something that the church enters into. So I hope that you can see that in reading the rest of Genesis and reading the Old Testament and then going on into the New Testament and focusing on the doctrine of the church, that we can say that we're Abraham's seed if we've trusted in Christ and we've entered into that third aspect, but that we also need to just let the other two aspects of the Abrahamic covenant say what they say and expect a literal fulfillment, because that is certainly what Abraham expected when he believed God in Genesis 15.